A 30-man death squad walked away from the Mexican military in 1999. What followed was the most sustained campaign of terror Mexico had ever seen. Not a war, not a conflict, a systematic, calculated, military-grade extermination program that left mass graves scattered across entire states and turned towns into ghost towns overnight. Most people think they know what a cartel is. Traffickers, smugglers, men with guns protecting drug shipments. That is not what the Zetas were. The Zetas were something this continent had never produced before and has never fully recovered from since. These were special forces soldiers, government-trained, government-funded, men who had studied counterterrorism alongside American advisors, who had learned to breach compounds, surveil targets, and conduct operations that left no trace. When they defected, they did not just bring their weapons, they brought everything the government had taught them, every tactic, every method, every technique designed to hunt and destroy criminal organizations, and they pointed all of it in the opposite direction. What they built was not a cartel in any traditional sense, it was an occupation force. Towns in Tamaulipas woke up one morning under Zeta control and never woke up free again. Businesses paid or burned, officials cooperated or disappeared. Civilians who saw too much got added to mass graves that investigators are still excavating today. The violence wasn't random. That is the part that changes everything once you understand it. Every execution, every massacre, every burned body in an oil drum was a message. Deliberate, precise, engineered by men who had been trained to think like soldiers. And the deeper you go into how the Zetas machine actually worked, the more disturbing the picture becomes. It all started with one man making one decision that changed the course of Mexican history forever. His name was Arturo Guzman de Tena. He was a lieutenant in GAFE, the Mexican Army's most elite special forces unit. Young, decorated, and by every account, exceptional at his job. The kind of soldier governments build careers around. In 1999, at 23 years old, he walked away from all of it. Not because he was broke, not because he had been mistreated. He walked away because a Gulf cartel boss named Ociel Cardenas Guillen made him an offer that the Mexican army simply could not match. Cardenas Guillen was not looking for more gunmen. He had plenty of those. What he needed was a weapon the cartels had never possessed before, a trained military force that could go toe-to-toe with the Mexican army and actually win. Guzman de Tena understood exactly what he was being asked to build, and he built it. He went back to the people he knew, former GAFE colleagues, soldiers who were underpaid, overlooked, and already disillusioned with a government that sent them into dangerous situations with almost no support. One by one, they crossed over. Each man brought his training, his contacts, and his understanding of exactly how the Mexican military thought and operated. By the time the group had its name, Los Zetas, they were already something genuinely new, not a cartel unit, a paramilitary organization embedded inside one. They set up training camps in Tamaulipas. They recruited former Guatemalan special forces known as Caibiles, men with their own brutal reputation, to help expand the program. They were not just building enforcers, they were building an army. And what that army did next is where this story gets truly hard to look at. The Zetas did not just kill enemies, they made killing a language. Every execution was a sentence, every body left in a public place was a paragraph. Every mass grave was a chapter in a message directed at anyone who even considered standing in their way. Rivals, government officials, journalists, civilians. It did not matter. The Zetas operated on one principle. Fear is more powerful than money, and they were right. Decapitations became their signature, not because other groups had never used them, but because the Zetas turned them into a communication system. Bodies appeared on highway overpasses with handwritten messages attached. Heads were left outside police stations. Videos of executions were deliberately distributed and passed through communities like warnings. People watched them not because they wanted to, but because they needed to know what happened to those who said no. Then came something even darker. The guiso, the stew. Victims were placed inside oil drums, doused in fuel, and burned alive. What made this method different from other cartel executions was not just the brutality, it was the audience. New recruits were forced to watch, sometimes forced to participate. This was not punishment, this was manufacturing. The Zetas were not just killing enemies, they were transforming young men into people who could never go back to a normal life, which meant they could never leave the organization either. Entire towns stopped functioning. Businesses shut down. Families fled. In some municipalities in Tamaulipas, there was no local government left that the Zetas did not control completely. And the worst single moment of all of this, the event that finally forced the world to pay attention, had not even happened yet. August 22nd, 2010, a ranch outside San Fernando, Tamaulipas. 72 people dead in a single room. Migrants, men and women from Ecuador, Brazil, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. People who had scraped together everything they had for a chance to reach the United States border. They never made it past Tamaulipas. Zeta gunmen stopped their vehicles at a checkpoint, separated them from their belongings, and gave them one choice: join the organization or die. When they refused, every single one of them was executed. The only survivor was an Ecuadorian man who was shot, left for dead, and walked wounded for hours before finding Mexican soldiers. His testimony led authorities to the ranch. What they found there was almost too much to process. But San Fernando was not a one-time event. It was not an explosion of uncontrolled violence. It was policy. Less than a year later, investigators returned to the same region and pulled 193 bodies from 47 separate mass graves. Victims were pulled off buses on the highway. Passengers going about their lives were stopped, assessed, and killed when they were deemed useless to the organization. The scale of it forced a reckoning not just in Mexico, but internationally. The DEA, American intelligence agencies, and foreign governments suddenly understood that what was happening in Tamaulipas was not cartel violence in any conventional sense. This was a criminal organization behaving like an occupying army, eliminating anyone it could not control or exploit. By this point, the Zetas were no longer the Gulf Cartel's enforcement arm. They had broken away completely. They were operating independently across more than a dozen Mexican states. And that independence, that decision to go it alone, is exactly what started pulling the whole thing apart. The split from the Gulf Cartel in 2010 was the moment the Zetas stopped being untouchable. For years, the arrangement had worked because the Gulf Cartel provided the economic foundation. It included the trafficking routes, the supplier relationships, and the political connections that kept money flowing even when operations got disrupted. The Zetas provided the muscle. Take away that foundation, and suddenly the most feared paramilitary organization in Mexican history was left holding territory it could not monetize, and enemies it could not afford to fight on every front at once. The war that followed was catastrophic. Gulf Cartel gunmen and Zeta death squads tore through Tamaulipas in battles that left entire city blocks burned out and hundreds of bodies in the streets. Both sides bled, but the Zetas bled in ways that could not be replaced. Losing trained military operators was not like losing street recruits. These men took years to build and could not simply be replaced by pulling teenagers off corners. Heriberto Lazcano was killed by the Mexican Navy in October 2012. His body was stolen from the morgue by Zeta operatives before a formal identification could be completed. It was a final act of defiance that changed absolutely nothing. Miguel Trevino was pulled off a dirt road near Nuevo Laredo in July 2013 in an operation that lasted minutes. The organization fragmented almost immediately. Splinter groups formed, and internal wars broke out over territory. What had once been a unified force dissolved into competing factions, destroying each other from the inside. But here is the part that most people miss entirely. The Zetas lost. Their leaders were killed or arrested. Their structure collapsed. Yet the methods they pioneered, the training camps, the systematic terror, the paramilitary model, did not disappear with them. Other organizations absorbed every lesson, and those organizations are still operating today.